Hello everybody, my name is Damon Stanwell-Smith. I'm the Head of Science and Sustainability here at Viking, and welcome to Viking.TV. Today I am delighted and honoured to be welcomed to a conversation on Viking.TV, George Sranko. George is a naturalist, a photographer and accomplished public speaker, and welcome to Viking.TV, George.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Damon. It's a great joy to be here.
Well, it's wonderful that you're here, and I understand it's the first time you've had a chance to talk to Viking TV viewers.
Yes, it is.
Many of whom who are Viking guests. And my first understanding is that you have sailed with us on several voyages, so I'm guessing many of the Viking TV viewers may have seen you spinning wonderful stories on board our vessels before.
I hope so. Very nice to be on Viking TV, and the folks I meet on Viking ships, I do have to say, they are the most attentive, and the audiences that someone like me would just love to have any opportunity. So it's a great joy.
Well, it's wonderful, and it's and as in our conversations prior to airing, you've mentioned how storytelling is very much part of the way that you communicate so effectively. Can I start at the beginning though? So if we were to wind the clock back and say, can we find a little bit about a young George and where you grew up and your origins and what brought you into your illustrious career?
Well, go right back to the early days when I was a toddler, and I was born in Australia. So I have dual citizenship, Australian Canadian. And I like to say that I survived my first year in Australia, because living out in the suburbs of Sydney, my parents would take me out into the lawn and let me sit there. And then they'd come back and I'd be playing with the spiders. About the Australian spiders, those funnel webs who live in those suburban lawns are quite deadly. So I like to say I survived my first year. And then when I was, before I was 2 years old, we moved to Canada. And so really, I lived ever since 2 years old in Canada. My first memory of Canada, in fact, is a snowbank in Montreal, which was 3 times higher than I was as a 2-year-old. So, and most of my life has been in Canada since then. Traveling, we lived in many places. My father was working in construction, and so we would travel. I think I've lived in about 8 or 10 different locations in Canada. But we finally settled down around Vancouver on the West Coast. And so that was where from my teen years on, I was hunting for fossils in the areas around Vancouver. I was always a little nerdy kind of a kid who was, my first thing was to get out and take photographs of insects when I was early teens. And I picked strawberries so I could afford my first camera. And this is back in the 60s, of course.
From an early age.
Yeah, so my insect photography was, believe it or not, that kind of launched my career. When I was a first year university undergrad, I saw this job opportunity with national parks, and they were looking for a naturalist. And this was a job that I could only have dreamed about. And so I went to the interview. I had some of my photographs of insects. You know, I was so naive. I just thought, well, what can I show these guys that's going to impress them? So the only thing I had really was pretty amazing bug pictures. And I managed to convince them that I got a naturalist job as a park naturalist in the national parks up in the Rocky Mountains. for the
I'm
first.
sure that showed a good eye for detail and an enthusiasm for the natural world.
Oh, it's that job. Ever since then, I just cannot believe my luck because 18 years old and very introverted, and then they gave me this position where basically I was launched in front of a group of anywhere from 50 to 100 audience, and I had to come up with the topics and the lectures, and so it was a trial by fire those first couple of times that I had to give these public lectures in front of a big group. That was a first time for me, but it really
Yeah,
molded the rest of my life.
that's fantastic. And I think that being able to explain a subject in an imaginative way, you have to know the subject. I imagine that you had to bone up on all the topics you're about to share with those national park travelers.
Yeah, it was a steep learning curve, but here I was a photographer, and they basically gave me a camera, endless supply of film. They said, go out, learn everything you can about the national parks, actually experience the trails, the wilderness, come back with photographs and talk about it when you have a chance in front of the public. So
what a lovely brief.
It was quite amazing. So of course, as a sort of a young biologist for all of my life, I just launched right into every fauna and flora, but also the biology, the geology. Living in those mountains was just such a exceptional experience. Glaciers really became a big fascination for me. Mm-hmm. And I believe my second summer, we get to choose sort of a field study for that summer. And my second summer, I chose this really interesting idea that by then I was so familiar with the park. This was Glacier National Park up in the Selkirk Mountains of British Columbia, that I could look at the photographs, the old-time photographs of the glaciers, and I thought, wouldn't it be fantastic? And we had this giant press camera. It must have weighed about 20 pounds. And I said, I'm going back to that exact same location. And so these were photographs that were taken in the late 1800s, 1880s, 90s. And so I would go back to that exact location, retake the photograph. But this was in the 70s. And even at that time, the glaciers had receded in a kilometer in many cases. So it was this opportunity to do this scientific research, do the incredible hiking up onto these ridges, because the places these people had gone, they had to be mountain goats. But I managed to get up there, get these photographs, and that I wrote this incredible, I look back on it, and it must have been an incredible report, but I didn't keep a copy of it. And I've gone through the archives, and I can't find those photographs.
Oh, how frustrating! Because of course, I imagine now there's, another step in the time series of seeing glacial retreat and change, and
big studies actually have been taken place by research from the universities of those exact same glaciers, but they've receded another kilometer or so since those days.
And the power of photography as a research tool as well as a communication tool there.
Yeah.
And I can imagine sort of Ansel Adams style carrying a big plate camera up in the 1870s compared to its.
Even the camera I had, it was a press camera that it had a large format, so it was.
Oh, really? Oh, fantastic! I imagine fantastic resolution, beautiful.
Yeah,
Imagine.
So I don't know what happened to those photos.
Oh, maybe they're in an attic somewhere, or in a lab somewhere, or National Park
I
office.
don't know. But
And,
actually, they've done some great studies since then. So the glaciers in the Rocky Mountains of Canada, they actually predict that by 2050 or so, you won't be seeing many glaciers. They're receding so quickly.
it's tragic, isn't it? And it's the use of photography in that way is actually resonates with some of the research that Viking is actually doing in Antarctica, using images from the past and images now to look at change as well. So it's a powerful tool all over, isn't it? And did this lead into a particular college pathway, or did it shape your education?
Well, I continued at the University of BC with a degree in zoology, and really I worked as a career with national parks for many years as a naturalist. And then when was roughly I was in my 30s, and we moved to Victoria, where I live now, which is the capital of British Columbia. And I became more of a consultant, working with government, and continued my interest really in recreational topics. So I became part of doing a sort of groundwork breaking work on something called Limits of Acceptable Change, which was a recreational planning tool for trying to figure out, this concept of carrying capacity in national parks and parks of any kind, which really became replaced. This carrying capacity notion was that, well, you just come up with some sort of a number on how many people should be allowed to use a certain trail before the impact is just overwhelming.
Well, I mean, it's the whole rather challenging discussion about what is sustainable, isn't it? It's a word that means many things to many people, and I can imagine was this an early idea of how a national park can sustain the visitors without seeing change.
Yeah, that was a big thing. But once we started to research carrying capacity, the next best thing was this limits of acceptable change, and that was had much more scientific rigor to it. So what we actually did in the national parks, a project that I launched was this notion that we had to come up with some objective way of analyzing which trails had the highest use. So we put use counters out, and then we had field studies where we would try to come up with a notion of which trails were receiving the most impact. So I put this all together, very objective set of numbers, and that actually guided where we would spend our money. And also we could involve the public in terms of what were the limits of acceptable change, which is this notion that you come up with geographic sort of indicators of what's beyond sustainable. And once you have those indicators, then you start thinking, well, how do you implement policy and strategies prior to those indicators being met, so that you establish the limits and then you set procedure and your policies in place so that these things, you kind of have a handle on it. But it's also in concert with the user groups, which is something that national parks, even in the 70s, we were, I think, doing a good job of involving the actual user groups in making these decisions. Because up until that time, it was in many ways national parks were our own private realm. And I'll never forget some of the first wardens I met. this one fellow, he was an Aboriginal from a tribe back in Ontario, and he was working in the Western National Parks, and he was telling me they were actually good poachers, and they had hired them as wardens, but then they put them in this national park on the north shore of the Great Lakes, and they had to spend the winter basically in a cabin. So they ended up eating a couple of moose to survive. So this is back a long time in national parks.
Oh, I can imagine. Can I ask,
Yeah.
I mean, when you say it changed, and you talk about your early experience of comparing photos from the 1870s to then, what do you use as a baseline? What did you? Is there ever a time in your experience in the Canadian national parks that is considered pristine or with zero human interaction?
Well, I think in the early days, in the 1880s, the first national parks were set aside as places where people could enjoy. Actually, it was done in concert with the railways. They had the railway going through Canada, and it was going through these incredible mountain landscapes. So they felt they could have people enjoying by having lodges in the national parks, but it was very concentrated. And so they would have really high-end lodges where the railway would stop. People would stay for a day or a few days, and then they would enjoy the scenery. But the rest of the national park really was quite wild. And so in my day, we started to come up with the notion of zoning, and it's called the recreation opportunity spectrum. But this idea that if you have a zoning in place, people before they arrive in the national park, they're going to have a pretty good notion of where you can go if you want to do, sort of concentrated recreation in terms of hard packed trails, good campgrounds, even something like a lodge to stay in, versus if you're just going to head off on your own with a tent in your backpack. The zoning really gives people a good idea of how and where to go. And then also the very important aspect was to protect certain areas where we had high ecological values and really put limits on the number of people that could access those areas. So I think in my career, zoning has been a big part of the, how do you manage, in the early days, we would talk about managing the bears, and we realized, no, that's not really the concept. We have to manage the people.
Yes, yeah, exactly. The bears just do their thing. And it feels to me from what you're saying that as paradigms change in terms of the naming, it's all the same thing. I imagine you look at modern conservation practice like spatial planning and think, oh, we were doing that a while ago too. It's the names change, but the concept is consistent.
Yeah, but I think there's better and greater awareness of the importance of wilderness and having certain areas that are off limits, which is in national parks these days. It's kind of a controversial topic, actually. There's so much pressure in. I'm thinking of the Rocky Mountain National Parks in Canada and in the States. Throughout the national park systems, one thing that I don't know in Britain, but in North America, due to largely COVID, people just want to get out into nature, out into the national parks, and actual visitation numbers have almost doubled in those last few.
Exactly years. The same in the UK, and I think it's a global phenomenon, isn't it, of managed wild spaces where people have realised that 2 years of having it taken away, the desire to get to wilderness areas has been manyfold increased. And have you noticed, I mentioned at the beginning how, you know, you self-identify as a storyteller, and I realize that you're a very accomplished storyteller. In the wide range of subjects that you have given talks on, has there been a shift in interest in terms of stories more about change, about things? What is the range of topics that you've discussed?
Well, I talk about, well, one of my recent trips was to Australia, to the Great Barrier Reef, and we started diving. Well, I'm not a diver, I'm a snorkeler, and I'm not a great swimmer, to tell you the truth, but we went to the Great Barrier Reef for the first time in 1985, and we took one of these catamaran trips, the fast trips out to the outer reef. And 1985, it was like I had arrived on a different planet to go down into the Great Barrier Reef. As a snorkeler, I wasn't even diving, but just an incredible experience. The colors, the varieties. We were fishing with hump-headed Maori wrasse, which were the size of a small car, you know. And and in those days, I don't know if it was lack of awareness or what, but we never really thought twice about wearing anything other than a bathing suit. And so we would go jumping in. Actually, the people who were on the tour would tell us that keep in mind whether you can swim or not, because we've had people jump into the water, they're so excited, and then realize that they can't swim. But then we were just back there last year again, and now, of course, you don't go into the water without a stinger suit, which are these lycra full body suits because of the jellyfish. And so I don't think there's been enough really rigorous scientific research to establish a baseline, but the general impression seems to be that there's more jellyfish around. So, that's the reality of the Great Barrier Reef now. Of course, you can still get in the water and see incredible sights, but just the experience of being much more aware that there are jellyfish around in these waters. And potentially, some of those box jellyfish can be very, very dangerous.
So, George, I can see that you've survived Australia a second time in your travels in the 80s around the Great Barrier Reef. And I see there's a really interesting observation that ties into maybe your early observations of the national parks of observing change. Specifically with the box jellyfish, I understand that you have an interest in box jellies and have been telling stories about them too.
Yes, well, the box jellies, as I mentioned, they weren't really top of awareness. People who lived up in Queensland, of course, even in those days, we were always wondering why there's these incredible beaches and there's no one swimming. And it's because the locals had what was called the stinger season, and when the box jellies were prevalent. And the problem with the box jellies is we talk about jellyfish as not having any brain, but these box jellies have eyes that work and they have a memory. So the box jellies are actively fishing, and they can actually remember where they caught fish. And they come into the shallows, and in Australia, half the time the shallows are filled with fishermen standing there in their shorts, casting into the ocean water. And so the fishermen would get entangled with box jellyfish. But the tourists really had no inkling in the 80s. So it's only once box jellies became well known, and unfortunately, people from other countries um, had unfortunate experiences that they started to instigate these rules that if you're going to go swimming, you need to wear a stinger suit, and that's all year round now. It's not just stinger season.
And I guess for our viewers, box jellyfish can give a terrible sting, can't they? It can be fatal, is that right?
Yeah, there's one particular. Yeah, there's one particular species that if you have 5 feet of stinger wrapped around your arm or leg, it could kill you in 3 minutes.
Wow.
So very, very, if you don't have immediate medical attention, there's many people that in the early days, they would think they must have drowned because they would just disappear so quickly. But now we realize that the box jellies have a big role to play. So interesting story is that last time I was on the Great Barrier Reef giving presentations, it's sort of a tricky subject, you know. I don't want to scare people, but I want to make them aware that these creatures are there. And Australia already has a bit of a reputation. So, but I try to finesse the topic so that I can tell people about the box jellies. And I have photographs of people wearing stinger suits. And I used to say, you know, it doesn't matter what shape your body is. You're not going to look good in a stinger suit. But my wife said, no, you should switch that around. And so now I tell people, it doesn't matter what body shape, you're going to look great in a stinger suit. And
absolutely. Yes, exactly. Wetsuits.
And they come in multiple colors. You can choose what you're.
But I mean, the theme there of the world becoming slightly less pleasant for humans, I guess, with parasites or different stinging things becoming more prevalent. It seems to me that there's the common thread is that you have an uncommon gift of being able to turn a small natural historical story into a very compelling story. Has that been a theme with how you publicly communicate when you're sailing in all different places?
Yeah, I have just a range of topics. I know I'm popular on cruise ships because when we're crossing Atlantic Ocean, for example, there's many sea days, and you know, typically you won't see a heck of a lot. There's occasionally you'll see some wildlife, but not very often. But I love to bring up the oceanography, and I have, you know, fantastic images that I haven't taken, but that are publicly available, showing the bottom of the ocean and bathymetry and what it looks like. And so I have these stories about Doc Ewing, for example, who was a Columbia professor, and he was an explosives kind of a nut, and he would cross the oceans on expeditions where he would toss dynamite in 45-barrel drums overboard, and then he could record the reflection off the bottom of the ocean and get some idea of the depths, you know. But not only that, the geologic structure. He was a very well-known geologist. So he had these transects by, I believe, 5 times he crossed the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, doing this periodically and getting enough data. They had these data points, and he came back to Columbia, and there was a lady who was just the perfect person to take this data, just reams and reams of numbers, you know, and she started doing the mapping of the ocean floor. So this was in the 40s, 50s, and 1950s and 60s. And then she came up with this first oceanographic chart of the entire, not just the Atlantic Ocean, but the world. But the Atlantic Ocean, they start to realize there's an incredible mountain chain down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And so here I was in the 70s as a university student, and the notion of plate tectonics and drifting continents was really a topic of conversation. But the big question in the 60s was, what's the mechanism? Like, literally, how can you have continents drifting around on the surface of the planet? But Marie Tharp and her colleagues, they could very clearly show that this mountain range was where ocean crust was being created. And so I always tell people when we're on a trip across the Atlantic Ocean, you're getting good value for your money because the Atlantic is actually getting wider. At about the same pace as your finger. Sorry, Damon. Same pace as your fingernails growing. But the Pacific Ocean is the opposite. It's shrinking. So it's less of a bargain.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you get there a little bit closer to get a cold drink. Well, I think it's fascinating, isn't it? And in the course of one career, whole paradigms of how the world works can be found. And what we learn at school isn't necessarily I'm sure when I was learning about planets, there were 9. It's, those changes are fascinating. And I understand that you have a particular interest in time and in terms of understanding things and how knowledge shifts, and also an understanding of deep time. And how do you communicate that in a storytelling way?
Yeah, I've wrestled with this because as a biologist, and you're familiar with this notion of deep time, we talk about this planet, our planet Earth, being 4.5 billion years old. And so for many years, I was using a clock face. And you can basically draw quadrants on a clock face. And for the first half of the Earth's history, oxygen didn't really exist in the atmosphere. And so these interesting blue-green algae came around roughly 2.5 billion years ago, and they started to pump oxygen into the atmosphere, stromatolites. And I've gone to Western Australia to look for stromatolites, and I found them. There's a viewpoint, and there's just these green, gray lumps in the ocean. But these stromatolites did such a fantastic job of pumping oxygen into the atmosphere that they actually poisoned the existing creatures that had evolved, single cell creatures that had been around for roughly 1 billion years at that stage, and killed them off largely. Except now, another thing that we talk about in terms of change is the black smokers. And here's an entire ecosystem built on chemosynthesis, not photosynthesis, at the depths of the bottom of the ocean. So when we're crossing the Atlantic, I'd love to talk about the fact that these are ecosystems that we didn't even learn about in the 70s. We didn't know about them. And it's an entire way of using the energy taken from bacteria, synthesizing chemicals related to, the black smokers of the lava and gases that are erupting from the mantle at the bottom of the ocean. So it's a whole, I mean, that's an endless series of
Well,
topics.
that's a fascinating topic, and it's yes, all these extraordinary things. The world is an extraordinary place, isn't it? As we explore it, and there's of the many places that you've explored over the years. Do you have any particular most sort of memorable moments or locations that jump out?
Well, I love Africa because of the being a biologist. Yeah, I dreamed for many years of ever going to Africa, and then the opportunity has arisen a few times. So, and I love going to Kruger National Park, for example. The national parks in Africa, a place where you can experience wildlife. Uh, I mean, it's still an epic kind of an experience that uh, we in North America, um, one of the things I talk about is the lack of the megafauna in North America, whereas in Africa the megafauna still exist. And I remember, when we first went to Kruger, uh, it's actually achievable for the ordinary person. Hire a car and drive into Kruger. And I remember we were looking at this ridge, and I was telling Jan, my wife, look at those trees really are moving somehow. And of course, they were giraffes and silhouetted along the ridge top, and they were taller than the trees. And as they were moving and swaying, we realized that we're not looking at trees. So that whole experience as a biologist and learning about the species and I could go into amazing stories about the elephants and the crocodiles and the hippos. One of them in the Okavango was, for example, we went in the Okavango. We had a guided trip, and it's just my wife and I, and we had makoros, which are those native canoes, but now they're built of fiberglass, and villagers would take us up into the islands in the Okavango, the largest sort of a delta. Amazingly, you have a delta, landlocked delta. So it recedes and it grows, expands with the seasons, of course. But we were there during the tail end of the dry season and navigating around, stayed on an island for one, I think it was a three nights. And as we were sailing on the Makoro, being pulled by a guide who was called Scar, and Scar had one eye, but his other eye was fantastic because he was saying, keeping an eye out, and he'd heard that there was a hippo in the main channel. So all of a sudden he took off sort of through the reeds, and he said, if the hippo does overturn the Makoro, don't swim. And I thought, well, what kind of advice is that? He said, try to stay underwater and make your way to the shore without breaking the surface. Don't swim and thrash around because the hippo will find you. So thankfully, we never did meet the hippo. But of course, they've lost villagers with the hippos. And the hippos are under to the point that you don't even know that they're there. So the villagers communicate to one another the locations of the hippos in the main channels. But then Scar took us to this island, and I'm so used to areas where we're looking at the wild animals on the other side of the fence. But here on this island in the Okavango, I could hear the lions roaring at night. And the first thing they told us when we arrived there was, once you go into your tent, don't leave the tent because there's wild animals roaming around here. And sure enough, in the morning, I say to him, those lions sounded pretty nearby, didn't they? And he says, oh, no, don't worry. They're a couple of kilometers away. I know exactly where they are. And then every day we would go for these long walks through lion country. And I was a little bit nervous, but he really, he knew exactly where the lions were. But the one time
do you think that it? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut in. I was just going to say that your fascination with the megafauna now, the big wild animals now in Africa, is it resonant of maybe how national parks were in North America, or even all the lands that they're covered before humans intervened, should we say?
Well, I think the whole megafauna story for national parks, though, is different in North America because, well, we do have large elk, grizzly bears, and where I worked in Glacier National Park, there were a lot of grizzly bears, and you know, our tactic would be, as we're hiking these trails, we would make a lot of noise and singing, and if we're on our own. Nowadays, actually, that's one change. In my day, we were roaming freely, solo hikers throughout the national park. But now there's rules where they only allow 3 or more hikers in certain areas where there's grizzly bears. So my solo hiking days are long gone, of course.
Well, you say in your day, but it sounds like you're very actively traveling still. That it is still your day.
Oh, definitely. But my day of being able to do those solo hikes, it wouldn't be allowed anymore.
Yes,
No.
I can imagine. Yeah, absolutely. And given you have travelled so much and seen so much, do you have places or experiences that you still have on the list to go and recreate photos, maybe, or go and see what they're like?
Well, this will be coming up, our first trip up in north of the Arctic Circle, and so that'll be a great opportunity to. I do weave in quite often the loss of sea ice, for example. It's so prevalent up in the north, the far Arctic, and how that has changed the jet stream, for example, which is something we can all relate to. I think we've all experienced changes in climate. This year, for example, in Canada, is the most extreme fire season ever experienced. We have, I believe there's something like 200 fires in Canada right now at the moment. So that's a big change. The boreal forests throughout the north, the far north, are far more vulnerable to fire, and these are extreme events in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
Many towns and villages in those forested areas are being evacuated because of forest fires. So we're all familiar with these changes, and so I like to explain how the loss of polar sea ice has affected our climate with the changing of the jet stream. Yes. And it's the same in Europe and North America. We get these big loops of jet stream bringing extreme weather further south. And we tend, where I live here in Vancouver Island, now we get these really strange phenomenon. A couple of years ago, we had this very extreme heat sort of locked in. So as the jet stream made a loop, it kept the heat in one area around our area. So where I live, if we have temperatures of into the 30s, that would happen maybe once or twice a year, 30 degrees Celsius. That day, it went up to 38 in Victoria. A heat dome effect So we had the heat dome here for nearly a week, and in our province, uh, the 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 facts and figures are that 600 people lost their lives because of that heat dome.
Yeah.
So it's having this incredible effect. I mean, no matter where you live, but exceptional changes up in the Arctic. So it's
Well,
definitely something to mention.
I think that yes, your ability to weave that into stories is people take it on board. If it's just being presented with facts, that can be quite challenging at times. And as well as storytelling, I know that you're a best-selling author. And how do you go about choosing the topics for books? When does it go from the spoken word to writing it down?
Well, there's so much interest in octopuses, for example, and I love to talk about octopuses because here's this creature with 9 brains, 8 arms, thousands of suckers, which actually taste and feel, and so that's my latest book is the Octopus Paradox, and it's this. The paradox is, how is this creature, which is so different from us, with 9 brains, a central brain, and then a mini brain or a smaller brain in each arm, capable of functioning and has so many characteristics of being an intelligent species? And I often say, you know, we spend billions of dollars looking for intelligent species on other planets. And here's several intelligent species on this planet that we'd have no idea what's going on. And
Oh, I
we're
think
just
we're
becoming
very mammal centric, aren't we? It's, you may remember several years ago, wasn't there an octopus that was predicting the football or the soccer World Cup results, and
yeah.
recent films of one in particular I know has raised awareness of octopus. And correct me, it's octopuses, isn't it? Not octopi.
Octopuses, yes.
That's
Yeah, it's because it's a Latin octo, 8 arms,
not Greek, I suppose.
not Greek.
Well, I think it looks a fascinating topic, and it's and from my own marine background, it's wonderful that you're sharing knowledge about such interesting marine creatures. And so you say there's Midnight Sun is next.
Yes.
That's it's the high Arctic, and will you be sailing with us?
Yes.
That's
I'll be on the Viking Venus. So we're very fortunate to, I always consider myself incredibly fortunate to be able to voyage with Viking and take in these places that someone with my kind of interest, it's like a dream come true, and I'm very familiar with orca whales. Some of the best studied orca killer whales are here, right off the waters where I live in Vancouver Island. So I've been researching quite a bit about the orca up in the north, and one of the things I've run across is the extreme shift in, for example, the apex predators in some of these Arctic waters, where you talk to the Inuit people up in northern Canada, and the orca whales didn't really frequent the Arctic waters until recently. And now they're actually hunting narwhal up in the Arctic, which is a complete change in apex predator. So very interesting stories about
another very
changes.
intelligent species. It's I can say from previous career in professional diving that I never worried about sharks. I always thought about orcas and other marine mammals, malevolent marine mammals, were the creatures that I always were most wary of, rather than sort of stimulus response in terms of the way that a fish might respond. But well, George, sort of time moves on, and I'm sure our viewers would be delighted to sit all evening and hear more stories from you. And those that are watching that will be on Viking Venus and no doubt other ships in the future too, I'm sure will have a fantastic opportunity to hear more of your tales. But thank you so much for taking the time to share some insight into the natural history observations that you've made over many years, and the wonderful way in which you share that with us all.
Thank you so much, Damon. It's been a real pleasure. I appreciate it, and thank you so much for the work that you're doing.
Well, it's conversations like this that make it all worthwhile. It's lovely to learn so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Damon.